the invitation that changed everything. Jonathan Harper had spent most of his adult life buried in work. As a renowned reproductive specialist, he had built a reputation as the man to see for couples struggling with infertility. Patients flew in from across the country to consult with him, and medical journals regularly featured his insights. His expertise brought joy to many, yet his own life remained devoid of the very happiness he helped others achieve. For years, he had carefully cultivated a life of precision, discipline, and solitude. His work came first, always. There was no room for distractions, no time for social commitments, and certainly no space for love. Jonathan had convinced himself that his lifestyle was a choice, a deliberate strategy for success. But deep down, he knew the truth. Love had once been part of his life. A woman had once filled his world with warmth, laughter, and dreams of a future together. Emily. The name alone was enough to cause a familiar tightness in his chest. Years ago, she had been his everything. They had made plans, marriage, children, a home filled with love. And then, without warning, she was gone. No explanations. No closure. Only a hastily written note telling him that she couldn't stay. He had searched for her at first, driven by heartbreak and disbelief. Then, when no trace of her could be found, he buried himself in his work, allowing his career to consume him entirely. Now, he was 38 years old, a man at the peak of his profession, respected, accomplished, and completely alone. It had been years since Jonathan had attended a social event that wasn't directly tied to his field. Weddings, birthdays, parties, he avoided them all. So when the invitation arrived in the mail, his first instinct was to throw it away. The envelope was sleek, cream-colored, with gold-embossed lettering. It was the kind of invitation that belonged to a lavish event, the kind he had long distanced himself from. With mild curiosity, he turned it over and saw the sender's name. Ethan Cole. A memory flashed in his mind. Ethan had been his best friend in college, back when life had been simpler, before he had become the man who hid behind his work. They had been inseparable once, sharing late-night study sessions, road trips, and dreams of the future. But as life moved forward, they had drifted apart. Jonathan had never intended for it to happen, but somewhere along the way, his priorities had shifted. He hesitated before opening the envelope, feeling a strange sense of guilt. He had let so many relationships slip away. Inside, the elegant card announced Ethan's wedding, scheduled for the following weekend. Jonathan exhaled sharply. Weddings weren't his scene. Love, commitment, he had spent too long pretending he didn't miss those things. But this wasn't just any wedding. It was Ethan's. The man who had once been his closest friend. And perhaps a chance to reconnect with at least one part of his past. For the first time in years, Jonathan made a decision that had nothing to do with medicine. He would go. The wedding venue, an unshakable feeling. The venue was breathtaking. A grand estate sat nestled at the edge of a serene lake, surrounded by towering oak trees draped in strings of fairy lights. Guests milled about, dressed in their finest attire, sipping champagne and exchanging warm greetings. Jonathan adjusted his tie as he stepped onto the stone pathway leading to the ceremony area. He had dressed appropriately for the occasion, a tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and an expensive watch that he rarely wore. Yet, despite his carefully curated appearance, he felt like an outsider. He spotted Ethan near the altar, laughing with his groomsmen. Despite the years apart, the man hadn't changed much. He was still the same charismatic, easygoing guy Jonathan remembered. As if sensing his presence, Ethan turned his head, his eyes widening in surprise. "Jonathan?" A genuine smile crossed Ethan's face as he strode toward him. "I almost didn't believe you'd come." Jonathan shook his hand. "Neither did I." Ethan laughed, slapping his shoulder. "Man, it's been too long. You look exactly the same. Still serious. Still making the rest of us look lazy. Jonathan smirked. And you look exactly like someone who's about to make the biggest commitment of his life. Scared for me? A little. Ethan chuckled. Don't be. Mia's the best thing that's ever happened to me. He gestured toward a group of bridesmaids standing near the archway. She should be arriving soon. Wait until you see her. Jonathan nodded, though something about Ethan's words made an odd sensation settle in his chest. He had no reason to feel uneasy, but there was something off. Shrugging it off, he took a seat near the middle of the aisle, nodding politely at the guests around him. As the ceremony began, the music shifted, and everyone turned their heads in anticipation. The bride appeared at the far end of the aisle, a vision in white. Mia. Jonathan barely registered the collective gasps of admiration from the crowd. He was frozen in place, his breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. The bride was stunning, with delicate features and graceful poise. But Jonathan wasn't focused on that. He was focused on her eyes. They were familiar. Too familiar. A chill ran down his spine as his mind struggled to catch up with what he was seeing. He had spent years trying to forget those eyes, to erase them from his memory, but they were burned into him. Mia was Emily. His Emily. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe his mind was playing tricks on him, that it was some bizarre coincidence, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. She was supposed to be gone. She had disappeared without a trace. And yet, here she was, walking down the aisle toward his best friend. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. A million questions surged through him, but none of them mattered in that moment. She looked happy. Radiant. Like she had moved on. Like she had forgotten him. The wedding continued as if nothing was amiss, but Jonathan barely heard the vows. His pulse was roaring in his ears, his muscles tense with the weight of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Then, as Ethan lifted Mia's veil, something else caught Jonathan's attention. A detail so small, yet so impossible to ignore. Her ankle. A tiny scar just above her ankle bone. A scar he remembered tracing with his fingers on quiet evenings when they lay tangled together in bed. The world tilted. His vision blurred. And before he could stop himself, he stood up. Gasps echoed around him as heads turned in his direction. But he wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about Emily, no, Mia, and the inexplicable truth unfolding before him. What the hell was going on, the woman who wasn't supposed to exist? The entire room fell silent. Jonathan stood frozen in place, every muscle in his body locked in shock. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward him, but he barely registered them. His focus was on one person, her. The woman standing at the altar, dressed in a pristine white gown, glowing with the radiance of a bride in love, wasn't supposed to exist. At least, not in his world. She had vanished years ago, disappearing without explanation, leaving behind only a few vague words in a crumpled note. Jonathan had searched for her, had spent countless sleepless nights trying to understand why, and yet, here she was. Emily. Or, as everyone else seemed to know her. Mia. A name that meant nothing to him, but a face that had once meant everything. She had changed. There was a newfound confidence in the way she carried herself, a grace that was both foreign and familiar. Her hair was styled differently, her makeup flawless, and her dress shimmered under the soft glow of the chandeliers. But none of that mattered. Because the scar was still there. A small, nearly imperceptible mark above her ankle, a scar he had traced with his fingers so many times that he knew it better than his own palm. And that was how he knew, without a shred of doubt, that it was really her. A lifetime of discipline had taught Jonathan how to keep his emotions in check. He had stood in operating rooms, performing complex procedures under immense pressure. He had delivered devastating news to patients with nothing but a calm, steady tone. He was a man who didn't break. But this? This unraveled him. His heart pounded against his ribs as he forced himself to breathe, to make sense of what was happening. His brain was scrambling for logic, for a rational explanation, but there was none. She was alive. She was here. And she was about to marry his best friend. Jonathan? Ethan's voice broke the tension. Jonathan's head snapped toward him. Ethan's face was etched with confusion and mild concern. The guests were whispering among themselves, wondering why a man who barely spoke at social events had just stood up in the middle of a wedding ceremony. Emily, Mia, stared at him too. But her expression was unreadable. And that was the part that rattled him the most. Not recognition. Not guilt. Not fear. Just nothing. As if he were just another guest. As if the years they had spent together had never happened. Jonathan felt his pulse skyrocket. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a look-alike. This was her. And she knew exactly who he was. So why wasn't she reacting? Why wasn't she saying anything? His throat felt dry. He should sit down. He should stay silent. He should let the ceremony continue. But he couldn't. Not yet. A silent conversation in a room full of noise. For a split second, Jonathan saw something flicker across her face, panic. It was brief, so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed. But he did. He had once known her better than anyone. And in that moment, he understood one thing: she wasn't expecting him to be here. She had no idea he would show up today. And now that he had, she was terrified. That realization made Jonathan's blood run cold. If she had simply moved on, if she had left him because she had fallen out of love, why would she be afraid? What was she hiding? The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably. Sir, is there a reason you've... Jonathan swallowed hard, forcing himself to think before he spoke. He had to be careful. Whatever was happening here, he wasn't about to explode in front of a room full of wedding guests. I'm sorry. I thought I recognized the bride from somewhere. Mia, Emily, held his gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around the bouquet in her hands. The moment stretched into something unbearable. Then, she smiled. It was a soft, practiced smile, the kind brides give when they're too happy to be bothered by anything. But Jonathan knew better. He could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. The way she adjusted her veil just a fraction of an inch. The way she didn't look at Ethan the way a bride was supposed to look at the man she was about to marry. She was faking it. But why? Ethan let out an easy laugh, clapping Jonathan on the shoulder. I should have figured. You probably met someone who looks like Mia at one of those fancy medical conferences you go to. She's got one of those faces, huh? Jonathan forced himself to chuckle, but his mind was spinning. Yeah. I guess so. Still, you looked like you'd seen a ghost, man. Ethan grinned, oblivious to the storm raging inside his best friend's head. Come on, sit back down. You're freaking out my mother-in-law. Jonathan hesitated. He should leave. He should walk away, pretend none of this was happening. But how could he? How could he let this go? How could he let her go? Still, he nodded and took his seat again. The ceremony resumed, but he barely heard any of it. His mind was consumed with a singular, inescapable question. What the hell happened to Emily? And why is she pretending to be someone else? After the wedding, a confrontation that can't be avoided. Jonathan left the ceremony early. He couldn't sit through the reception, pretending everything was fine. He needed answers. So he waited. The estate had a long, winding pathway that led toward the guest cottages, where the wedding party was staying. He knew she would come this way eventually. And she did. It was nearly midnight when she appeared at the end of the path, her white dress trailing behind her, looking almost ghostly under the moonlight. Jonathan stepped out of the shadows. She froze. For the first time that night, her mask cracked. She knew she couldn't pretend anymore. Jonathan took a step forward. "You're not Mia." A long silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she said, "Jonathan, please. Don't do this." His chest tightened. Hearing her say his name after all these years was like a punch to the gut. But he wasn't backing down. "You disappeared." His voice was rough, heavy with unspoken pain. "And now you're here, standing in front of me, about to marry my best friend, acting like we never even existed." She clenched her hands together, her entire body tense. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me." He took another step forward. "Because right now, it looks like the woman I loved faked her own death and built a whole new life." Her eyes shone with something that looked like regret. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." His voice was sharper than he intended, but he couldn't help it. "Why, Emily? Why did you leave me? And why are you lying to everyone here?" She sucked in a shaky breath, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone would see them. Then, finally, she whispered the words that changed everything. "Because if I hadn't left, you would be dead." A truth that shouldn't exist. Jonathan Harper felt the air rush from his lungs as if he had been struck in the chest. He had imagined countless scenarios about why Emily had left him: cold feet, lost love, even betrayal. But this? His death? A deep silence stretched between them, the only sound coming from the distant echoes of music from the wedding reception. The glow from the estate cast long shadows on Emily's face, but Jonathan could see the fear in her eyes. A fear that was real. For years, he had buried the pain of her disappearance, convinced himself that she had simply stopped loving him. Now, with those 6 words, she had flipped his entire reality upside down. His voice was a raw whisper. "What do you mean?" Emily swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder again. "She's afraid of something. Or someone." The realization made Jonathan's stomach tighten. "I can't talk here," she muttered. "Not where people might see us." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He was done waiting. "No more running, Emily." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Tell me now. Why did you leave me? Who was going to kill me?" Emily hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled sharply. "Fine. But not here. Follow me." She turned abruptly and started walking toward the gardens behind the estate, where the lights faded into darkness. Jonathan hesitated only a second before following. The secret beneath the surface. The night air was cool, scented with the lingering fragrance of flowers. Emily led him past the carefully arranged hedges, past the lantern-lit pathways, until they reached the far edge of the garden, where the estate met the thick woods. She stopped. Then she turned to face him. Jonathan crossed his arms, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. "Talk." Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan, the reason I left, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because I had no choice." His eyes narrowed. "That doesn't explain anything." She let out a shaky breath. "I was being watched." Jonathan felt an icy chill run down his spine. "Watched by who?" Emily looked down, pressing her lips together as if she was debating whether to say the words aloud. Finally, she lifted her gaze to meet his. "My father." Jonathan frowned. "Your father?" But he stopped himself. She had never talked much about him. In the years they had been together, Emily had always avoided the topic. Jonathan had assumed it was because they were estranged, but was it something more? My father isn't who you think he is, Emily continued, her hands twisting together. To the world, he was just a businessman. But behind the scenes, she swallowed. He was involved in things. Dangerous things. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. What kind of things? Emily hesitated. Jonathan, do you remember the night before I left? When you got that call from the clinic and had to leave late? He nodded. How could he forget? They had spent the whole evening planning their future, talking about marriage, children, a life together. He had left for an emergency surgery, expecting to come home and find her still in their apartment. Instead, he had come home to a note and an empty closet. Emily exhaled sharply. That night, after you left, he came for me. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He told me that if I stayed with you, if I didn't disappear. She hesitated. He was going to kill you. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He took a slow step back, trying to process what he had just heard. Emily, your father, threatened to kill me? She nodded. Not just threatened. He showed me proof. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Proof of what? Emily sucked in a breath. Proof that he had already hurt people before. People who got in his way. Jonathan felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. This was insane. He had spent years believing Emily had simply walked away. And all this time, she had been protecting him from a man who was willing to kill to keep them apart. Why? Jonathan demanded. Why would your father care about us? About me? Emily hesitated, then whispered the last thing he expected. Because he didn't want me to leave his world. And you were the only thing that could have made me walk away from him for good. The man who never let go. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. So what happened next? You just vanished? Emily's expression was full of pain. He made me leave. He said if I didn't, you'd be dead before morning. So I packed my bags, I wrote the note, and I disappeared. Jonathan shook his head. Why didn't you tell me? Why not call? Why not ask for help? Emily let out a bitter laugh. Help? Jonathan, you don't understand. He has people everywhere. I wasn't just running from him, I was running from an entire network. If I had contacted you, even once, he would have found me. And he would have killed you. Jonathan's mind was spinning. So you changed your name. Started a new life. He swallowed. Met Ethan. Emily flinched slightly at that, guilt flashing across her face. I never planned on falling in love again. But I had to create a life. A safe life. One where he wouldn't suspect I was still looking over my shoulder. Jonathan's voice was raw. Do you love him? Emily opened her mouth, then stopped. She didn't answer. And that silence said everything. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Ethan. His best friend. A man who had no idea his future wife was running from something deadly. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Emily, Jonathan said carefully. Is your father still looking for you? Emily's eyes darted away. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. Emily. She exhaled sharply. Then, barely above a whisper, she said. He found me 3 days ago. Jonathan's entire body tensed. What? Emily looked at him, real fear in her eyes now. I don't know how. I was so careful. But I got a message. No name. No return address. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. Jonathan took it, hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the paper inside. There were only 3 words written on it. I see you. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The past wasn't behind her. It had found her. And if what she said was true, that meant Ethan was in danger, too. Jonathan looked back up at Emily. We need to go. Now. Emily nodded, her hands shaking. And then, somewhere in the darkness, a car engine rumbled to life. Jonathan turned sharply. Headlights flickered in the distance. They weren't alone, the shadow that never left. Jonathan Harper felt the weight of reality crash down on him like an avalanche. The past wasn't just a distant memory, it was a living thing, slithering back into his life with cold, calculating intent. And now, standing in the shadows of the estate's garden, with Emily by his side, he realized that they were being watched. The low hum of an idling car engine rumbled in the distance. A pair of headlights flickered briefly through the trees before shutting off. Someone was here. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. Jonathan's instincts screamed at him. Get out. Now. He grabbed Emily's wrist. We need to move. She didn't resist. Instead, she looked up at him, wide-eyed and afraid, and for the first time that night, she looked like the Emily he remembered. The woman who once trusted him with everything. Where? She whispered. Jonathan scanned their surroundings. The estate was massive, sprawling across acres of land, but there were only a few exits. If the person in that car had been watching them, then they had probably anticipated any escape attempt. They needed to think fast. He exhaled sharply. We can't go back to the reception. Emily nodded. If he sees me with you, Ethan will start asking questions. Jonathan swallowed hard. Ethan. His best friend. The man waiting inside, completely unaware that his bride wasn't who she claimed to be. A bitter taste settled in Jonathan's mouth. Emily was lying to him. To everyone. But did she even have a choice? We go to my car, Jonathan said finally. We get out of here. Now. Emily hesitated. Jonathan. Emily. He locked eyes with her. If your father really found you, do you think he came alone? That did it. She sucked in a sharp breath and nodded. And then, together, they ran. A chase through the dark. Jonathan led the way, keeping low as they weaved through the dimly lit gardens. He could hear the distant sound of laughter and music from the reception, a cruel contrast to the sheer terror burning in his veins. Emily's fingers were gripping his tightly, her breathing shallow but steady. She had done this before. Run. Hide. Disappear. She was used to this. Jonathan wasn't. The parking lot was just ahead, rows of expensive cars gleaming under the estate's security lights. His own car, a black Audi, was parked near the far edge. They just needed to reach it. But as they neared the lot, something in Jonathan's gut twisted. Too easy. Something was wrong. His eyes scanned the lot quickly. His car was exactly where he had left it, but something felt off. And then, he saw it. A man. Leaning casually against a dark SUV just a few rows away. Dressed in a crisp black suit. Not moving. Not talking. Just watching them. Jonathan's grip on Emily tightened. She followed his gaze and immediately went rigid. You recognize him? Jonathan asked quietly. Emily's voice was barely a breath. He worked for my father. Jonathan's mind raced. If one of her father's men was here, that meant there were more. He glanced back toward the estate. If Ethan walked out here right now, he'd be caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. There was no time to think. No time to hesitate. Change of plans, Jonathan muttered. Emily swallowed. What do we do? Jonathan's eyes flicked back to the dark SUV. If they tried to get in his car now, they wouldn't make it out of the lot before that man, or whoever else was here, stopped them. They needed to disappear. Jonathan turned sharply, pulling Emily toward the tree line at the back of the parking lot. What are you doing? She hissed. Getting us out of here. Without another word, he pulled her into the cover of the trees. A desperate escape. The forest behind the estate was thick, dense enough to obscure them from view. Branches clawed at Jonathan's suit, but he ignored them, focusing only on getting Emily as far away from that parking lot as possible. Finally, when they had put enough distance between themselves and the estate, he slowed. Emily was shaking. He turned to her. Are you okay? She nodded, but her hands were trembling. Jonathan, this isn't going to stop. His jaw clenched. We'll figure something out. I promise. She let out a hollow laugh. You don't get it. My father, he doesn't let go. Jonathan exhaled. Then we stop him. Emily stared at him. And how do you suggest we do that? He's not just some angry parent. He has power. Real power. He has money. Connections. People who make problems disappear. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Has he killed before? Emily hesitated. And that was all the answer he needed. Jonathan felt something dark settle in his chest. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. This was about survival. I'm not letting you go through this alone, he said firmly. Emily looked at him, something unreadable in her eyes. You already lost me once, she whispered. You don't want to get dragged into this. Jonathan shook his head. It's too late for that. She opened her mouth to argue, but then. A snap of a branch. They both froze. Jonathan turned sharply. And then, just beyond the trees, he saw the silhouette of a man. Watching. Waiting. They had been found. Emily sucked in a sharp breath, her grip tightening on Jonathan's arm. Then, the figure lifted something to his mouth. A radio. Jonathan barely had time to react before the man's voice cut through the silence. Target located. Jonathan's pulse roared. They were out of time, the ghosts from the past. The safe house was deep in the countryside, a rundown cabin that looked forgotten by time. It was the kind of place no one would ever think to check, a perfect hideout for people who wanted to stay dead. Jonathan followed Emily inside, his eyes scanning the dark corners for any sign of movement. The air smelled like old wood and damp earth, but something about it felt, lived in. Who else is here? He asked, voice low. Emily turned toward the dimly lit hallway, hesitation flickering across her face. Someone I thought I'd never see again. Before Jonathan could press for more answers, a shadow appeared in the doorway. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with scars cutting across his jaw like battle wounds. His gaze flickered between Emily and Jonathan, sharp and assessing. Did you lead them here? The man asked, his voice a low growl. Jonathan stiffened, immediately on edge. Emily shook her head. No. We lost them in the woods. The man's eyes locked onto Jonathan's wound. You're bleeding. Jonathan exhaled. Yeah, I noticed. Emily stepped forward. We need help. We need to stop them before they hurt anyone else. Before they go after Ethan. At Ethan's name, the man's expression darkened. You think your fiancé is still safe? He let out a sharp laugh. Your father's men already know who he is. That wedding was the only thing keeping him alive. Emily's breath hitched. No. That's not possible. You think they were only watching you? The man shook his head. They know everything. The moment they saw Jonathan, they knew you were compromised. Now? Ethan is as good as dead. Jonathan's stomach twisted. They had wasted time. Too much time. Ethan was in danger. And Jonathan had just led the enemy right to him. We have to go back. His voice was hard. Now. The man narrowed his eyes. That's suicide. Jonathan met his gaze. Then help us. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, finally, the man sighed. There's a way, he said. But if we do this, there's no turning back. We either finish this, or we all die. Jonathan's fingers curled into fists. Then let's finish it. Emily looked between them, her face a mixture of fear and determination. She stepped closer to Jonathan, her voice barely above a whisper. You came to a wedding, she murmured. And now you're fighting for your life. For my life. Jonathan looked down at her, something fierce burning in his chest. I never stopped fighting for you, Emily. And he wouldn't stop now. Not until this was over. Not until they were free. A battle for the truth. Jonathan Harper had gone to a wedding expecting nothing more than an awkward reunion with old friends. Now, he was preparing for war. The truth had shattered everything. Emily hadn't left him by choice. She had been running from her father, a man so powerful, so ruthless, that his reach extended into the shadows of society. A man who would kill without hesitation. Now, Ethan was in danger. And Jonathan refused to let him die. The man in the cabin, Darren, was Emily's long-lost half-brother, another ghost from her past. He had been running just like she had, hiding from the monster that controlled their lives. But Darren was different. He was tired of running. He had spent years waiting for the moment to strike back. And tonight? That moment had come. The plan that would change everything. Darren unfolded a blueprint of the estate, laying it out on a dusty wooden table. His finger traced the map, stopping at a private security section. This is where your problem is, he said, looking at Jonathan. Your friend Ethan. He's not just some random guy anymore. He's engaged to the daughter of a man who doesn't exist on paper. You think they'll let him just walk away? Jonathan's fists clenched. Then we get to him before they do. Darren smirked. Easier said than done. Your buddy is surrounded. Your best shot. A distraction. Something loud enough to pull security away from the house so you can get him out before they realize what's happening. Jonathan nodded. I'll go in. Emily's head snapped toward him. No. You're hurt. I'll be fine. His voice was firm. We don't have time to argue. Darren leaned against the table, crossing his arms. And what do you expect me to do? Jonathan met his gaze. You said you wanted to fight back. Make some noise. Darren's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Now that I can do. Back to the estate, a wedding turned war zone. Jonathan crouched behind a hedge, his heart pounding as he surveyed the estate grounds. The reception had moved indoors, but security was heavier than before. They knew something was off. They were preparing for something. He moved swiftly, pressing himself against the side of the building, avoiding the roaming guards. From inside, he could hear the murmur of voices. The guests had no idea the man of the hour was about to be dragged into a world he wasn't prepared for. A sudden explosion shattered the night. The guards snapped to attention, radios crackling as they rushed toward the west side of the property. Darren's distraction had begun. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He slipped through the back entrance, dodging into a hallway lined with expensive paintings. His path to Ethan was clear. He reached the groom's suite in seconds. Pushing open the door, he found Ethan standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie. Jonathan?" His brows furrowed. "What the hell are you?" Jonathan grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Now." Ethan yanked back. "What?" Jonathan didn't have time for explanations. "I'll explain later. But if we don't leave this place right now, you're dead." Ethan stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, the door behind them burst open. 2 armed men stepped inside. Jonathan moved first. He grabbed a glass vase from the nearby table and smashed it into the first man's face. The second man lunged, but Ethan, finally understanding the danger, reacted fast. He ducked the attack and delivered a brutal punch to the attacker's ribs. The man staggered back, but it wasn't over. Jonathan grabbed Ethan's arm again. "Move!" They rushed into the hallway, dodging through the chaos as more guards flooded the estate. The plan had worked. Darren's distraction had pulled most of the security away. But not all of it. Jonathan saw the man standing at the end of the corridor before he even moved. An older man. Eyes cold as steel. And in his hand, a gun. Emily's father. He raised the weapon, aiming it directly at Ethan. Jonathan's body moved before he could think. A single gunshot rang out. Pain exploded through Jonathan's side. His vision blurred as he crashed against the floor. Emily's scream tore through the air. Then, another gunshot. Silence. The end of a monster. When Jonathan's vision cleared, Emily was standing over her father. The gun was in her hands now. Her father lay motionless, his weapon slipping from his grasp. She had shot him. Jonathan tried to push himself up, pain flaring in his side. Emily dropped the gun, running to him, pressing her hands to his wound. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice shaking. Jonathan's eyes met hers. "You saved us." Tears welled in her eyes. "You saved me first." Ethan, still in shock, knelt beside them. His face was pale, his entire world shattered in a single night. What the hell just happened? Jonathan exhaled sharply. The truth. The truth that had been hidden for years. The truth that had nearly killed them all. But now? It was over. Epilogue, a future rewritten. A week later, Jonathan sat in a hospital room, stitches lining his side. The pain was manageable. The weight of everything that had happened was not. Emily sat beside him, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked different now, lighter, like a woman who had finally let go of something that had haunted her for too long. Ethan had survived. Darren had disappeared after the fight, but not before leaving them with a final warning. You won this battle. But there are always more out there. Jonathan didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking back. He looked at Emily, at the woman he had thought he'd lost forever. She smiled softly. You never asked what happens now. Jonathan reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. I don't need to, he murmured. I already know. Emily squeezed his hand. For the first time in forever, they were free. And this time? Neither of them were letting go.